Scripture reading this morning, two selections. First one from Luke 24, 1 to 12. No, I'm sorry. Bulletin has John chapter 20, verses 1 to 10 listed first. John 20, 1 to 10. Titled The Empty Tomb. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. And Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, also went inside. He saw and believed. They still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had risen from the dead. Then the disciples went back to where they were staying. And we turn to Luke chapter 24, verses 1 to 12. Jesus is risen. On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were wondering about this, suddenly two men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. In their fright, the women bowed down their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still with you in Galilee. The Son of Man must be delivered out of the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the third day be raised again." Then they remembered his words. When they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the others. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the others with them who told this to the apostles. But they did not believe the women, because their words seemed to them like nonsense. Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. Bending over, he saw the strips of linen lying by themselves, and he went away, wondering to himself what had happened. We praise God for the reading of his holy word, and we'll turn the rest of our service over to Jesse.
Thank you, Wilmer. We are a society, we're a people that like to see people who have been battered and bruised, individuals who have had hardships in life, overcome those hardships. I mean, we would love, all society, whether Christian or not, would love to hear that Linda Stolzfus is safe and she can overcome and come back and live a really healthy life. I thought of that as we're sitting there. We like to see people overcome obstacles. We like to see people push through hardships. We like feel-good stories. We like second chance stories and opportunities to just overcome the things that all of us face in life, the hardships in life. And I think that's particularly clear when we look at our sports stars. We glorify and we revere those who can overcome any type of, and mostly in sports cases, it's a physical defect, whether it be an injury or an illness. And when I think of this, I think of basketball player Michael Jordan. He was recently back in the news as ESPN ran a 10-part documentary on Jordan's illustrious NBA career. And one of MJ's most famous or most memorable performances came in Game 5 of the 1997 NBA Finals. In this game, Jordan's Chicago Bulls, they were in a 2-2 tie in the series with the Chicago Bulls. Jordan going into the game was not feeling too well. He was quite sick, actually. And this game became known as the flu game, or Michael Jordan's flu game. Although ESPN in their documentary actually revealed that he didn't have the flu, he was actually dealing with a case of food poisoning. Now, if any of you have ever had food poisoning, I'm sure you can't imagine doing much of anything, much less playing a starring role in Game 5 of the NBA Finals. Yet Jordan not only found his way onto the court that night, even with food poisoning, but he managed to score 38 points. He had 7 rebounds. He had 5 assists, 3 steals, and 1 block, and he actually hit the game-winning three-pointer with less than a minute left, which gave the Bulls the win in the game and eventually the win in the series. It's over 20 years since that performance, yet people still talk about it. People are still mesmerized with Jordan's toughness, his ability to overcome that he showed on that night. It stands as one of the most famous, most memorable moments in the legendary career of Michael Jordan. Another example is many sports fans have probably long since forgotten the name of former NFL quarterback Byron Leftwich. Leftwich in the NFL, he had a rather average playing career. He mostly played for the Jacksonville Jaguars. But if you do remember the name of Byron Leftwich, you most likely will not remember any moment from his NFL career, but you might remember moments from his college career when he was the quarterback for the University of Marshall. Because in a game in November 2nd, 2002, he was playing against the University of Akron. Leftwich broke his leg actually during the first quarter. Of course, Leftwich with a broken leg, he was out for the rest of the game. Well, actually not. Leftwich returned in the early fourth quarter, and I have a picture here. It's pretty blurry, but he had to be, even with his broken leg, he had to be carried by his teammates from line of scrimmage to line of scrimmage, but he ended up playing through, and he ended up throwing for over 300 yards in the game. It's not too bad for a guy with a broken shin, a broken leg. He was still able to play and to throw for 300 yards. And a last example, and of course, if we're talking sports, I have to get a NASCAR reference in here. One of the most famous examples from that sport of a driver pushing forward is that of Ricky Rudd. At the start of the 1984 season, Rudd suffered this horrifying crash in practice for the Busch Clash right before the Daytona 500. In this crash, Rudd sustained a concussion, he had broken ribs, and he had a face that was so bruised and so swollen that to be able to drive, you see, when he would go into the corners and the G-forces would press down on him, his eyes would go shut, the skin would literally go over his eyes. So he had to be able to race, to be able to overcome that. It's another picture of the crash there. To be able to overcome that, Rudd actually literally taped his eyes open so that his eyes would stay open and he could drive in the race. And he still, even with that, all his literal bruises and scars that he had, he still ended up finishing 7th in the Daytona 500, and the next weekend he actually won the race at Richmond. And these are certainly all examples of overcoming challenging circumstances, of playing hurt and pressing forward while being beaten and bruised. We'll go back here for our main picture. And I say all that to say it because today we're going to be focusing our attention on a man who was about as beaten and bruised as one can get in this lifetime. Now this man, he wasn't beaten and bruised physically like we just talked about. This man's bruises and his scars are more of the emotional and the spiritual nature. The man that I'm referring to is Peter. And Peter, where we pick up here, where Wilmer just read, Peter's at a point where, in Luke and John that we just read, he's at beaten and bruised. He's about at the lowest point in life as you can get. Think about, and this is not always a pleasant thing, but take a moment, just think about one of your hardest moments, or if you can think of what was the hardest moment in life, when you were the most depressed, when you were both down in what I'm going to call throughout the pit of misery. That's where Peter is, where we pick up his story here on Easter morning before the women come and tell him what's happened. He is as depressed as one can feel in this lifetime. And I want to just take a moment here to think about Peter's story and think about all that he had to be wrestling with in his mind this morning. We go back in Peter's life and in time. Peter grew up and he lived his life as an unknown and an unimportant, uneducated fisherman from a small fishing village in Galilee. Peter is a fisherman, which is one of the least dignified professions of his day. He has no real claim to fame. He has no particular skill. He has no family wealth, no societal standing. But like so many of us, he treasured what he did have. It might not have seemed like much to Peter, or to the world. It seemed like much to Peter, but it was Peter's, and Peter's life might have seemed like an ordinary life, but it was Peter's ordinary life. He had a job that didn't provide abundance, but it provided for his family's need, a family that he loved and treasured and cared for very deeply. Peter's life was what many would call an ordinary life. Still, it was Peter's ordinary life until one day, while Peter was out fishing, Peter's life became anything but ordinary. One day, while he was carrying out his task as a fisherman, Peter met this man, and oh, was this man like anyone Peter had ever met before. This man had a power and a presence and a wisdom that no man Peter had ever encountered before had ever had. This man seemed to be able to exercise control over the very sea where Peter had spent his life struggling and searching for his provision. In fact, one time after Peter had fished all night and fished for hours without catching any fish, this man came to him and just told him to throw his net to the other side of the boat. And it ended up filling Peter's net to the point that they were overflowing and the nets were ripping. This man was like nothing Peter had ever witnessed before. This season was like nothing Peter had ever witnessed before. Peter could not understand what was happening or understand how this man was doing it, but Peter knew that he had to see more. And that's why, at the invitation of this man that they called Jesus, Peter made the previously unfathomable decision in his life to drop everything he knew and everything he had to follow Jesus, to follow and leave behind all that he had and all that he had formerly known to follow this teacher from Bethlehem. And at this invitation, Peter dropped everything and followed Jesus. And what a ride he was about to go on. And oh, the things that Peter witnessed this Jesus say and do. Peter saw Jesus heal the sick over and over again. He saw Jesus preach to crowds of thousands, gain a following wherever he went. He witnessed Jesus on multiple occasions feed those crowds of thousands with a few loaves of bread and a few meager fish. He saw Jesus call demons out of the possessed. He saw Jesus baffle the most educated religious minds of his day. He witnessed Jesus show honor and respect to the lowest in society's eyes, just like Jesus had shown Peter. He saw Jesus cause the blind to see and the paralyzed to walk. Jesus calmed the seas and rebuked the winds. Jesus walked on the sea and even allowed Peter to walk on the water as well. Peter even witnessed Jesus having a casual conversation with Moses and Elijah on the mountain of transfiguration. Peter, in fact, even got scolded by the thundering voice of God on that mountain. As if it wasn't enough, Peter even saw Jesus raise the dead to life on multiple occasions. Lazarus, the centurion's sons, all of these individuals, their hearts had stopped beating, their life had stopped existing in their body. Only to have Jesus command them to come to life again and to be awakened back to life again. Oh, the wonderful ride that Peter was on and the wonderful things Peter had seen and experienced and the ride that Peter was privileged to be on with Jesus. And a few days earlier from where Wilmer just read in Luke and John, it seemed like the climax of this journey Peter was on with Jesus was about to be reached. Peter saw Jesus ride into the ancient city of Jerusalem to a reception and applause that was fit only for a king. It seemed as if Jesus was about to take his position as king and set up his new kingdom over the Jews. And for Peter, he was going to get a privileged position as one of Jesus' right-hand men in that new kingdom. And for Peter, you have to be thinking what was going on in his mind at this moment is finally he was going to get the accolades he rightfully deserved. Finally, he wasn't going to be at the bottom rung of society. Finally, he was going to get the respect that he deserved. Finally, things were going to go Peter's way. His troubles were over. But unfortunately for Peter, the next few days went far from how he might have been expecting them to do. Jesus did not only not take his rightful place as Jerusalem's king, but he ended up arrested by the Roman government, accused and convicted of crimes that he did not commit. Jesus was beaten and flogged and ridiculed and tortured and hung from a cross to die between two ordinary criminals. Jesus, the man Peter had left everything he had and everything he knew to follow, not only was not going to be exalted as king, but now Jesus was laying lifeless in a borrowed tomb. This is a sad, sorry, almost pathetic ending for the guy Peter had left everything he knew, everything he had to follow. And now that was bad enough on its own. But Peter's depression, that pit that we talked about earlier that Peter was in, it was even more deep-rooted than all that. It was even more than mourning the loss of his friend and teacher and the man that he had left everything to follow. Peter's source of pain and his true source of shame and of guilt was in the role that Peter played in Jesus' arrest and execution. More clearly, it might be stated that Peter's pain was rooted in the role that he didn't play in Jesus' journey to the cross. Because you see, just hours before Jesus' arrest, Jesus predicted to Peter and the other disciples what was about to happen to him. That Jesus would be arrested and he would be crucified on a cross. At this, Peter boldly proclaimed before everyone there, before Jesus and the other disciples, that there was no way that this would happen on his watch. There was no way that Peter would allow anything bad to happen to Jesus. Peter would be right there beside Jesus through whatever was to come that night. To which Jesus, though, went the opposite direction and ended up predicting the future when he said that not only will Peter not be by his side that night in Jesus' season and his time of most need, that in that moment that Peter would deny even ever knowing Jesus 3 separate times before the sun would rise. And now as we pick up where Roma read on Easter morning, Peter sits wallowing in the depths of his despair, wishing that he could have proven Jesus wrong, wishing that for the first time in Jesus' life that he would have gotten something wrong. But to Peter's agony, Jesus was right again. While Jesus, the man Peter had left everything to follow, the man that had given Peter access to see so many miracles and wondrous works, while that man was suffering and dying, Peter was covering his own skin, denying that he ever even knew the name of Jesus 3 times before the sun rose, just like Jesus had said. In a few short days from when Jesus rode into Jerusalem to where we pick up right now, and I'm sure what felt like a few mere moments for Peter, everything in his life had changed. And now he was left to follow, or he was left to wonder what his future would hold. Asking questions like, would he ever get out of the pit that he was in? Would he ever get out from and under his circumstances and the weight that he was now seemingly trapped under? Now I want to step back out of Peter's time and come back to our time for a little bit, because I don't think that we have to think too long and hard for the last time we experienced a moment like this in our world now, do we? In fact, all that we need to do is maybe think back to March 15th, and if you've forgotten March 15th or what was going on at that time, let me jog your memory a little bit. It was a Sunday, it was March 15th, and Bishop Hill was here as our special speaker. Now, by this point, March 15th, the COVID-19 closures had started. Many churches and around the area canceled services for that day. So there were certainly hints that we were about to enter an unusual, maybe even an unprecedented time in our world. But I think even at this point, most people, I know I was, were viewing the COVID-19 pandemic as maybe a week or 2 disruption to our typical ways of life. Certainly, I do not think that anyone thought our world would pretty much be shut down for 3 months, causing unemployment numbers not seen since the Great Depression. I don't think any of us expected to see over 125,000 deaths in the U.S. alone from COVID-19. I certainly do not think any of us expected to never set foot in this room again to worship until after the July 4th holiday. COVID-19 and its ensuing pandemic, it's one of those rare circumstances or an event like a 9/11 or a recession or a world war where pretty much everyone is negatively affected by a single event, or in this case, by a single disease. In COVID-19's case, the negative effects could range in seriousness from a disruption to our normal rhythms of life, not being able to go to church, having to quarantine, not being able to eat out or go shopping and just do the things that we're used to doing. Those are all difficult, but they're relatively minor. There's, of course, the more severe effects like job loss or maintaining a job, what became known as an essential job, the stress of maintaining that job and going out and putting your own health and the health of your loved ones on the line while doing the things to keep our world running. That comes with stress, and that is difficult. And of course, the ultimate negative effect or the negative circumstance from a pandemic like COVID-19 is the loss of health and the potential loss of life. COVID-19 caused the world to go into a world of hurt, leaving many to feel battered and bruised by their circumstances, just like Peter, wondering if they could ever or would ever get pulled out of that pit that they were in, out under the weight of their circumstances. And maybe, because we're not out of the COVID-19 pandemic and all that came from it, maybe some people still feel like they are in that place right now, down in a hole dug by the pain of their circumstances, just like Peter early on Easter morning. COVID-19 is an easy example of how our world has been battered and bruised recently. But what about if we focus a little bit closer to home? I would put forth, and I think you'll all agree, that our church, Peckway, is in the middle of a difficult season, a season of uncertainty, and maybe suffered a few bruises and taken a bit of a beating of its own. Of course, COVID-19 shuttered the church's physical doors from that date, March 15th, until just last week. So I'm not so much talking about that, although that was difficult in and of itself. Because things have been a little bit difficult. There's been a tension in the air in the church even before that. And I'm being careful because I'm not placing blame anywhere. I'm just addressing what has been out there, and I think many of you has felt. Because it's no secret that the past 9 months have not been the most easiest 9 months in the church's 143-year history. And again, I'm not placing blame anywhere. It's just addressing what's out there. It's affected our leadership meetings and our outreach events and our worship services. Just about everything that the church has navigated for the past few months, it's carried a tension to it, a bit of a difficulty to it. And I know many sitting here, including myself, we've lost countless hours of sleep, wondering what the future was going to hold for the light on the hill in the village of Whitehorse. And it's certainly not like we sit here on July 12th and we have all of our answers. I mean, we sit here and we don't know precisely what the future holds. The PRC is still working on that future. I mean, we sit here today with a guy that's just halfway through seminary preaching our sermon. We don't have a pastor. We're uncertain of what the second half of 2020 has in store for us. We're certainly still in a moment of pain and healing and uncertainty. Just like Peter was on that first Easter morning 2,000 years ago. Just like our world is right now as we recover from a pandemic. So I guess the question is, since we resemble so much of Peter's story, both our world and our church and maybe even our individual lives, the question is did Peter stay trapped in his pit of misery on that Easter morning? Did he let his circumstances and the fact that he was beaten and bruised to the lowest point in his life, did he stay like that? Or did something change? Or did Peter come out of it? And how did he come out of his pit of misery? And how can we apply it to our lives? Well, I'm thankful to report that Peter did not stay in his pit of misery after that Easter morning where we just picked up. And I think it tells us how he did that. It tells us a lot about how we too can continue to overcome. How we too as individuals in our world and as our church continue to press on and push ahead even while we've been beaten and bruised as individuals and as Peckway EC Church. And we jump back into Peter's story, the other disciples' story, on that first Easter morning. And from here on out, I'll continue to be piecing together details from Luke and John's gospel that we read, and also a little bit from Mark's gospel of that first Easter morning, just attempting to paint the full picture of events, so you might want to keep your fingers in there. Now, on this morning, the women have not been able to finalize the burial process of Jesus. They haven't been able to finish his embalming process. So they get up early in the morning, and they're going to go to the tomb, and they're going to finish that process, embalming Jesus. And they're wondering on their way to the tomb, they're wondering who's going to roll away this enormous boulder from the tomb's entrance so that they can finalize the burial process. And I think that's an interesting detail that they add in there, and I thought about it in my preparation. I think it says a lot about Peter's mindset and the other disciples' mindset, how much they were probably down in this pit, how much they had lost all hope and were probably stuck in their depression. Because in Mark chapter 16, verse 3, Mark records the women asking the question. They say, who's going to roll away this giant rock away from us, or away from the tomb for us? So it's not like it had slipped their minds that there was this giant rock separating them from Jesus' body. It makes me suspect that they had probably asked some of Jesus' disciples, some of the men, some of the 11 or the others, as Luke records, to come and help them move this stone, but obviously they could find no one to come help them. And likely this was out of a combination of their fear for their lives, because this was not a great time for your safety to be a follower of Jesus. And it was probably also had to do with the depression and the pain of their circumstances that the disciples were feeling, that they chose to stay locked away in the safety and just wallowing in their pain at this house. Nevertheless, the women, they end up going to the tomb, and they didn't need anyone to roll away the tomb for them, because Jesus had already taken care of it for them. The women arrive at the tomb and they see the sight of the stone rolled away. There's an angel there to ask his famous question of them. He says, "Why do you look for the living amongst the dead?" The angels remind them of what Jesus repeatedly said while he was with them, that he will be crucified, that he will die, but that would not be the end of his story. That 3 days after his death, he would rise again, and the 3 days were up. Jesus has been raised to life again. At this, the women remember Jesus' words, and they run to the place where Peter and the rest of the 11 disciples were locked away. They proceed to tell all gathered there what they had just witnessed, what they had just experienced. Yet no one believed what they were sharing to be true because it, quote, seemed like nonsense to them. So the disciples decided, and those that were there decided to stay in their pit of their depression. They decided to stay locked away. They didn't go to see and even to consider that what the women had said could be true. Well, that is all but for 2 people that were there. John's gospel records that both Peter and John, I'm sure it sounded like nonsense to them, but you could be sure that they were going to at least go find out for themselves. They were going to go and test and see if what the women said were true, whether what the women said was accurate or not. And I want to pause here for a moment, because no matter what it is that has you battered or bruised this morning, whether it's the uncertainty in the church's future, whether it be from job loss or some other negative side effect of COVID-19, or something that we haven't even mentioned this morning, whatever it is that might have you down, the first thing we need to know is don't give up. Don't give up like the other disciples and the others that were there. Don't choose to stay locked in your past. Don't choose to be overcome by the weight of your circumstances, because there is hope and there is joy that is offered to us through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's a hope and a joy that is greater than any pain or difficulty in which we may be facing right now or we will ever face. There is a brighter future offered to us and promised to us through Christ's resurrection. But that hope and that joy is only available to us if we choose to seek it. John's gospel invites us over and over again until this very moment of Jesus' resurrection. Over and over again, he uses the 3-word phrase. He says, "Come and see." Come and see that all these wonderful things, these teachings, these miracles, these acts of service, everything we have recorded here in our Bible, everything that John and the other gospel writers and the other Bible writers record for us, John says, come and see that these things are real, that these things can be trusted, that these things actually happen, and that there is real life-changing power in seeing Jesus for who he is, the resurrected Son of God. And do you know why? At least I think John invites us to come and see and believe over and over, and come and see and believe in these things. Because if you look at verse 8 of chapter 20 of his gospel, which Wilmer read, that's precisely what he and Peter did on this first Easter morning. John and Peter, even in the midst of all that they were facing, all their agony, all of their difficult circumstances, they chose to come out of that pit and see Jesus as the resurrected Son of God, even though they didn't have it all figured out in the moment. And once you come and see Jesus as the resurrected Son of God, you cannot possibly stay the same. The thing that you have to credit John and Peter for, but especially Peter, because his mistakes and his circumstances and his difficulties are so clearly pointed out throughout the Gospels, is, yeah, they had messed up. Yeah, they were facing very difficult, very hard circumstances. But the very moment that there was some semblance of hope offered to them, that there might be a way to overcome their circumstances, they literally took off running to see if it were true, like we have portrayed here in this painting. They took off running to see if it were true, to come and see. And every single day that we wake up and are still able to draw breath in our lungs, we are given the same opportunity to come and see for ourselves, just like Peter and John, to come and see the truth of Jesus Christ, who he is and what he has done for us. To see Jesus as the Son of God, who breathed life into all creation, only to see his creation reject him and rebel against him in favor of things that are far inferior to him in his love. Yet even from that very moment of rejection and rebellion, Christ had the plan in mind that both you and I and all of his creation could be reconciled back into right relationship with him and his Father. Christ was willing, and he did execute that plan, even though it involved hard things like laying down his rightful position as the Son of God, taking on our sinful human flesh, living his life without fault as a humble servant amongst us, only in the end to die an undeserved, torturous death upon a cross. He did that for your mistakes and for my mistakes. He did that for your hardships and your trials and your mistakes and the weight of whatever has a hold of you this morning. Jesus on that cross, he took the weight of all the world's evil, all the world's pain, but it wasn't enough to keep him down. After 3 days, Jesus rose to life again. John and Peter, being just two of the hundreds of eyewitnesses who attest again that all that we have recorded here happened. That Jesus really is who he says that he is. And he really did what we have documented here. Now let me ask the question, if it only took 3 days for Jesus to forever defeat all the weight of all the world's evil and death and everything that is hard and is difficult, don't you think that he's plenty capable of overcoming a few months of quarantine and its adverse effects? Or a few months of tension, change, and transition within one of his churches? The question, though, is left up to us to answer. Are we going to let our bruises and our scars keep us locked away in our pain like the disciples that weren't named John or Peter? Or are we going to be like John and Peter and follow their examples and take off running, not knowing what the future or what the other side might hold, but you can be sure that we're going to do what John invites us to do. We're going to come and see what Jesus is doing and what he is up to and what he has done. As we sit here today, there are a lot of unknowns in our future, and there's a lot of pains in our past. But this morning, I'm asking you, will you, with Peter and John, with me, run to the tomb? See the place where Jesus' lifeless body once lay, yet experience the hope and joy and forgiveness and reconciliation, the healing, the mercy, the grace, the wisdom, all that is encompassed in Jesus' great love for us, and that is available to us when we see Christ crucified, dead, and buried, yet resurrected to life again. We're about to close with a song that's called How Great Thou Art. And it's number one in your hymnal and number one in my heart, as I said in the email on Friday. It's my favorite hymn. So as long as I'm choosing hymns, be prepared to sing it maybe once a month or so. But I want to call our attention. Hopefully I can get through this. I want to call our attention to verse 3. Verse 3 of How Great Thou Art reads, "And when I think of God, his Son not sparing, sent him to die, I scarce can take it in. That on that cross, my burden gladly bearing, Jesus bled and died and take away my sin. On the